I don't see the camera on. They're not on yet. Are we on? Okay.
It's going to be live stream.
Yeah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and all our viewers joining in from all over the world. We are right here at the Methane Pavilion at COP26 at Glasgow. I'm Zerin Osho from the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, and I will be moderating this panel discussion on building the methane movement. I'm here today with a panel of experts that have been leaders in building the methane movement. We have Mr. Gustavo Alanis Ortega, the Executive Director of SEMDA Mexico, Ms. Sarah Smith, Program Director at the Clean Air Task Force, and Ms. Tim Grabiel, the Senior Lawyer at the Environment Investigation Agency. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we must remember the civil society around the world has been the reason for a concerted effort on global methane, which has now given the world the Global Methane Pledge. And we must remember today that this journey started with our work, our concerted efforts on the need for reduction of short-lived climate pollutants, starting with the successes of the Montreal Protocol and the Kigali Amendment. And it is our success under the Montreal Protocol that should inspire us today to cut methane fast, to cut it now. We are now in the move. We have great science coming in from the CCAC assessment report and other organizations that talk a lot about the benefits and co-benefits of cutting methane. And we are now hoping to create this momentum and create the Global Methane Pledge into an actionable point, a bunch of actionable points, and hopefully a global agreement that can give to us aggressive cuts of methane. Through this session today, we hope that we better understand the role of civil society and in understanding how and what needs to be done in order to replicate the success of the Montreal Protocol in the context of the Global Methane Pledge and share learnings from the concerted efforts of the coalition. Without further ado, let's get started. So Gustavo, my first question is for you. Mexico has a lot of strong methane rules and regulations on paper. What do you think is going to be the necessary steps, next steps in the process in order to get a strong implementation of those standards and procedures?
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. And let me start by telling you that in the case of Mexico, Mexico not only has signed the pledge, which of course is very good news, but always the big challenge is implementation. Mexico has always been a champion in signing. Many times it's the first country to go and sign. But then when we go back home and it's a matter of starting to put things in practice, we don't do it very well. So let me give you an example. There are some regulations in Mexico that should have been in place for controlling methane emissions. And for some reason or for another, the oil company, which is owned by the Mexican government, has requested an extension of those rules or those dispositions in order to be postponed for 3 more years, no? Because they said they were still not ready to go with that. No? So in our case, the Mexican Environmental Law Center, we thought that was something that could not be happening. So we say, okay, what are we going to do? So we decided to use the law, and we decided to legally challenge this because we believe it was a moment to pass from the dispositions themselves to the implementations. And this is something that has been happening for years in other areas, no? Like clean fuels, for example, no? Where also the oil company has been postponing since 2009, has been postponing and postponing. And we came today and it doesn't happen. So we decided to bring a legal action to assure that the judicial power could force the Mexican government to properly and timely implement these dispositions and assure that Mexico is going to go in the right direction to cut methane emissions. So that would be my first reaction to your question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sarah, the US has been a key partner in building up the Global Methane Pledge, and you, through the Clean Air Task Force, have been a critical part of the pledge. What have really been your learnings? What has been your experience, and what do you think are the next steps in order to, make the pledge perhaps a global agreement?
Thank you, Zerin, and it's such a pleasure to be here with these panelists from around the world who are part of this growing ecosystem of civil society organizations around the world that are pushing for this pledge and also here to ensure that it results in action. In 2012, I started forming a coalition in the United States called the Methane Partners Campaign. Started out with just 4 or 5 organizations, but quickly grew to more than 100 NGOs around the country. And my learning is that the co-benefits associated with methane reduction bring people together, including unlikely actors. So when we cut methane emissions, we also cut volatile organic compounds, hazardous air pollutants like formaldehyde and benzene that are leaked alongside of methane gas from oil and gas equipment, for example. We heard on the last panel about noxious fumes from landfills. So the health benefits need to be considered. And we started quantifying the reduced asthma attacks and even the reduced premature deaths as a result of strong standards to cut methane. In addition, there's the waste angle, which helped us bring in taxpayer organizations and investors. And of course, the climate benefits, which you mentioned, the methane assessment coming out. That understanding of methane being the strongest lever to slow near-term warming, that has also helped grow the movement. And I think it will in the future. This philanthropic agreement that we heard about last week with more than $330 million is something I hope we'll have a chance to discuss a bit here today too, because it opens the door to bringing in much, much wider array of actors.
It's fantastic. Thank you. Tim, we've seen, the European Union champion the cause alongside with the United States. What do you think are going to be the priorities for the NGO, the civil society communities moving forward?
Good question. Let me first thank you for allowing me to participate in this panel. So the European Union has been trying to exert some leadership in this space for a while now, and I think it came to a culmination last year when they produced their European strategy to reduce methane emissions. Now the strategy itself focuses on 3 sectors. I'll quickly name them, but focus on the energy myself. But they're looking to reduce methane emissions in energy, agriculture, and waste. And so the main contributors to the methane that we're seeing today. And in this strategy, they committed to submit legislation that would attempt to address at the European Union level the methane emissions that are occurring within our borders, and then to consider how we could possibly influence the methane emissions that are resulting from our consumption of oil and gas and coal. And so they have outlined a series of measures that they intend to put in the legislation, which will be proposed in December, and normally there's a 2-year legislative process that follows. And in it, we have monitoring, reporting, and verification, because it's very important that we get the numbers right. Fact-finding. Fact-finding is a condition for good policymaking, and you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And so we're expecting to see some robust MRV requirements coming in that proposal. And then following that, we need to focus on mitigation itself, though. And there, we want to see mandatory leak detection and repair, to which the European Commission has committed, and then a ban on routine venting and flaring, which the Commissioner Simpson recently announced would be a part of the proposal. There'll also be some measures on trying to deal with abandoned or unused wells and mines, because that's legacy methane emissions, and we need to cap and seal those. And so we'll see some effort in that space towards resolving that problem, at least within the European borders. But what I think is most interesting is the potential scope to extend these measures to our consumption of oil and gas and coal. And so there is some consideration being given to applying this across the supply chain, which is extremely important. We import 80% of our fossil gas, which is what we call it now in the EU. We import over 90% of our crude oil, and we import over 40% of our coal. and most of the methane emissions associated with those fossil fuels occur upstream, outside of EU borders. And so there's some consideration being given on how to do it. It's unclear whether the European Commission will propose something robust that includes not only domestic but also supply chain emissions. But we have had some positive indication from the European Parliament that they intend to try and pursue the extension of these measures across the supply chain to our imports as well. A lot is to be decided. But I think the European Union is taking the opportunity through its own domestic legislation to lead by example. And I think this will build, this is something that we can build on to argue for and push for and secure continued leadership at the international level, especially in the context of trying to fill out the Global Methane Pledge and trying to create some sort of framework to deliver on and strengthen it in the coming years.
That's very interesting, Tim. In fact, I was just wondering, maybe given how the EU as a bloc participates in these discussions, I'm very curious to understand your take on what would be the measures specifically taken by civil societies in order to push the EU, which then acts as a key actor at the global level, be it as a bloc or be it as bilateral, trilateral, multilateral negotiations. What do you think is the role of the civil society in pushing the EU as a bloc?
Yeah, I think civil society are those that set the goalposts for what meaningful action is.
Absolutely.
And we need to then drive our policymakers and decision makers towards that. We have been setting the goalposts domestically within the context of the legislation, and we hope to secure some ambition when that is finally adopted in a few years. But with respect to the international level, the Global Methane Pledge came upon us quickly. We have a large number of signatories, but we have a lot of conspicuous omissions. I think the EU needs to be pushed on what would it entail to ensure that we are meeting the commitments that we've made within the Global Methane Pledge, and how can we do it to bring on board more actors. And so civil society, I think, plays a role in pushing the leadership at the EU level, in influencers, towards articulating a vision for what's needed and then acting upon it with some robust diplomatic efforts.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Gustavo, if I can come back to you once again.
Yes, please.
What do you think are some of the next steps? As the Global South, and we're looking at the Global Methane Pledge being discussed and the different implementation agencies, how Tim said, we're looking at MRVs, we're looking at making the pledge a realistic, actionable item. How do you think, or what do you think are the next steps involved in the process?
Yes, let me give 2 or 3 ideas in this respect. First, I would say that financing is crucial for this to happen. In the case of the Mexican government, for example, the Minister of Foreign Affairs has been at the G20 meeting in Rome just a few days ago, requesting the sufficient financial resources in order for countries to really commit to climate change mitigation. No? And I believe this is very important because in the case of many countries, they do need the money in order for things to happen. No? But at the same time, there needs to be some harmony. No? There's need to be a real commitment from those countries to really do things to fight climate change. And let me tell you why I say this. You cannot go and ask money at the international forum, and then at home you will be promoting the use of fossil fuels, no? Which is the case of Mexico today. No? We have a government which is pushing for fossil fuels, for the use of gas, petroleum, oil, coal. No? They are promoting coal power plants. They are promoting the construction of refineries. No? They have submitted a constitutional amendment just about 3 weeks ago, where they give priority to fossil fuel, particularly coal, and put renewable energies in the back of the seat. So this is something that is not consistent. No? So if we're going to talk about requesting financing, we need to make sure that we do things accordingly at the national level. Another idea that I can put before you is that we may want to partner with other instruments at the international level. For example, I don't know if you are aware, but within the NAFTA context, Mexico, US, and Canada had committed to reduce 40 to 45%, more or less, reduction of methane emissions for the year 2030. No? So that's not that far, no? And it's a very important percentage, no? So how are we going to assure that this really happens within the NAFTA context if we do not support this from other efforts that are happening at the international level? So one of the things that I believe need to happen is that, for example, in the case of Mexico, is that we need to develop the proper regulations, as I mentioned in my first intervention. But not only that, we need to go to full implementation. No? I mean, we have always suffered an illness which has to do with non-effective enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. And this is something that was discussed since the first NAFTA. No? I'm talking about the 90s, the beginning of the 90s. No? So what is going to happen to really assure that we're going, as I said, to develop and implement properly? And I bring this to the table because, for example, the Office of the Attorney General for Environmental Protection in Mexico is the one who is in charge of enforcing environmental laws and regulations. They have suffered a reduction in their budget of 60% in the last years. So how this is going to happen? Who is going to make sure that really the implementation is going to be there? No? So I think this is very important because at the same time, if we do not meet the goals to reduce methane emissions, we're going to be committing other legal irregularities. For example, in Mexico, we have the right in the Constitution to a healthy environment. No? Article 4. No? It's like a human right. How can you assure that that is going to be fully respected if methane emissions are going to continue going out there? No? So, as I said before, we need to make sure that we have the proper regulations and we have to have the proper policies in order to make sure that from the government there's a direction to go and really track and reduce the methane emissions. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Sarah, coming back to you, once again, the US has championed the cause, and we started out with 8 or 9 countries in September, and by December now we're looking at 105 countries essentially joining the pledge. What are the next steps? What does the US plan on doing? What is the role of the civil society? How is the civil society engaging with the US government on the issue? And if you could give us some nuggets on what could be expected from the US as a bloc, that would be...
It really is remarkable how quickly this took shape.
It really is.
And I think speaks volumes to the power of the partner groups pushing the EU and the States and Mexico to help sign on early, champion, get other countries involved. And I can tell you with the methane partners, they are more energized than ever around this issue. The US Environmental Protection Agency just last week announced their proposed rules for the oil and gas sector, and they're a good start, but we're going to press to make them even stronger so that, as Gustavo mentioned, we can hit that target that the US has committed to and hopefully exceed it. We're also going to be pushing for the states to go beyond just the oil and gas sector, because like so many countries, the methane emissions in the United States come from a multitude of sources, including landfills, where we do have some standards, but they should be strengthened. There should be better monitoring, including from the agriculture sector, where there's been some work on biogas digesters at larger farms, but there's much more to do. And so we're pushing through legislation for more appropriated funds, more focus on research, more focus on action across the board. And so the next 8 years are really going to be a sprint, and I'm excited that there's so much momentum now behind this issue.
Fantastic. That's actually really hopeful. Gives hope to all the youngsters, even at COP26, who are waiting for action and waiting for action now. And I think this is going to be a great start. I actually have a question for all the panelists here. Please feel free to jump in. Given that you are amongst the leaders that have built the movement, I'm curious to know, what do you think are the gaps that need to be filled? And how fast do you think we can fill those gaps in?
Sure, I'll give a first go at it. I would use the term loosely at the moment, movement. Right now, I think we are a series of coalitions that are coming together, but we haven't necessarily created the movement that we need at a global level to deliver on what we need. I think defining, so that would be one of the first order of business is we need to have the trust, the joint strategies, the sense of purpose and objectives that tie in all the different aspects related to reducing methane emissions and moving away from fossil fuels. We've done that imperfectly to date, but I think we have an opportunity to do it, and movements by their nature then sort of live on and grow and become ever more powerful influencers in policymaking circles. And so one would be I would encourage us to strengthen the engagement that we have within regions, across regions, and identify how we can collectively, even though we may focus on more narrow things, collectively drive towards a unified vision. Which then gets me to the second one. I think as a movement, we need to define what we want, and we need to be very clear in our demands. And with that as the benchmark, we are then able to sort of understand where countries fall on either side, where energy needs to be put to persuade, who are our champions, and how we can sort of cultivate and empower them even more to be forceful voices in these policy debates that are happening at the global level. And so creating a vision, one that would deliver on the Global Methane Pledge, I think is particularly important for us to all then be singing from the same hymn sheet. So the cacophony becomes a harmony, and so the policymakers need to respond. And on that front, I think there are four major pillars of where we should be focusing on sort of reaching agreement. I mean, obviously, monitoring and reporting globally is very problematic. We now have satellites in the sky. We have some new methodologies being formulated, but we need to harmonize those across the regions, across countries, so that we can have confidence in the numbers, baselines upon which to measure progress. And so the first pillar would be monitoring and reporting. The second pillar would be the actual mitigation itself. I think we know what we have to do. It's not rocket science, it's auto mechanics, as Mark likes to say. And on that, we'd like to see, concerted national action plans focused specifically on methane reduction being proposed, either as part of the nationally determined contributions, either part of it or an appendix to it, but something decidedly focused on the nature and the nuance of reducing methane emissions. And those could include things such as LDAR and bans on routine venting and flaring, measures on coal mine methane, abandoned wells and mines, and then protocols for dealing with super emitters who have a disproportionate contribution. So the second pillar would be the actual methane mitigation. And then within that, as mentioned by Gustavo, we need to then think of how we are going to provide the financial and technical assistance to the policymakers. And developing countries and countries with economies in transition in particular, because to meet these commitments, they're going to need some stable and predictable funding, something that's more than a one-off. We're going to have to create a structure that ensures the longevity of the commitment to achieve this. And this is not only 2030. This should be enduring and live beyond. So the third pillar would be technical and financial support and figure out what makes sense in that context. And then the fourth pillar would be coordination, because we have had a lot of different international agencies and actors in this space doing good work. We have the International Energy Agency, we have the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, we have Carbon Mapper on the private side, we have GHGSat, we have a lot of different activities that are occurring, and so we need to ensure that we bring in without to sort of create the synergies without and avoiding the redundancy. So ensure that we have synergy and avoid redundancy, and in that way, sort of bring together all these disparate actors in some sort of unified forum where we can work towards the same objective. So those are the four pillars that we've identified, and hopefully we can start to push this as sort of the basis for developing a framework.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Anything to add?
Yeah, let me jump in on this and try to complement what has been just mentioned. One of the first things that we would like to see is which is going to be the route, which is going to be the strategy that is going to be followed, for example, by those countries who have signed the pledge. No? I mean, because it's very easy, as I said before, to come and sign and then we go and nothing happens. No?
Yeah.
So it would be fantastic that, let's say, in the next 3 or 6 months, they will have a clear route on which is the way to go, which are the goals, no? How is going to, what are the actions, what are the programs to be implemented, no? And have a timeline, no? And say for this month of this year, this, for this month of next year, etc. No? So I think that that's something that's still something that we need to see happen, and I hope the sooner the better. And I say this because, and let me raise a question: what is more important than life? What is more important than health? No, and it appears that many out there still don't understand. No, I mean, what is at risk is our life, it's our health every day, every single day, and we don't see those policies implemented in that direction. And let me again give an example. In Mexico, every year, around 15,000 persons die because the poor quality of the air. No? There's no a single policy from the Mexican government to try to tackle that particular situation. No? So that's why I raise the question: what is more important than life and that our health and our quality of life? No? Second, I think you also raise a point about what civil society has to do. No? And I think, as Sarah mentioned, we need to keep the pressure. No? We have seen these days, until today, from last week, how powerful the media is, internationally speaking. I mean, the message is in all our countries, no? And everybody's writing and saying, this is everywhere, no? So let's take advantage, no, of the media that can help us to send the messages out there and keep doing press release and press conferences and as I said before, the legal actions, no, that we need to bring in order to assure that, legally speaking, the governments comply with what they have to do. Another area where I believe we have an opportunity is to approach legislators. I think we need to go to our Congress, no, to the deputies, to the senators, no, many of which they are here from Mexico in these 2 weeks. So I think we need to take advantage that they can also draft legislation, no? And they can publish this legislation, and then it will depend on us and the government and other sectors to make sure that this really happen, no? And finally, fully agree with the issue of coordination, no? And I would agree another word, which is harmonization, no? Because we need to harmonize the way in which countries do things with one another. We don't want a country to do this, another to do this, and then another, no? Because we need them to be fully committed in order for things to really happen.
And that's a fantastic takeaway. What is more important than life? I think that should be the new motto.
Wow, we're going to be busy setting the bar, getting louder, resourcing the groups in more countries, hopefully, as this moves forward.
Absolutely. I have one other question, and maybe if time permits, perhaps the final question. I'm from the Global South. I'm an Indian. I see the Global Methane Pledge being spoken about in the North American context. We have the Fast Action Fund, which is 300 million plus. And of course, we have Mexico being represented here on the panel. I'm very curious to know, for me, I do not see a lot of methane pledge being spoken about from the civil society, the global, in the South Asian region. I'm very curious to know from all you panelists here, how do you envision this gap to be filled? How is it that we're going to engage with China, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, all of those, that part of the world? And how do you think hard money, as Gustavo said, committed finance is going to be used in order to engage deeply with these countries?
It's a great question, Zerin, and I think alongside the focus of the northern governments, there's been a real focus on the philanthropy side in advocacy and civil society work in Europe, in North America. So I'm very hopeful that the new methane hub, you mentioned this $330 plus million commitment, will help resource organizations in India, in China, in really the global south to start working more on this issue. We have some representation in our growing global network, and we do need to ensure strong coordination and harmonization. But there's going to be a lot more work to do in the years ahead. So message to those watching who may be in some of these other countries is if you want to be part of the coordinated effort, there's still time to join.
I would just add that I have no doubt that there's at the moment, perhaps a silent uprising or movement that's just waiting to be triggered, as it were. I think it is a question of the historical distribution of resources and where some of the first opportunities arose meaningfully on the legislative front as things were unfolding in the European Union and the US. But we need to have a global movement, and we need Southeast Asia, and we need Latin America, and we need Africa to be on board. I'm quite confident that with increased resources, we'll start to have increased involvement from them, and hopefully that can happen rather quickly through the methane hub, so that we can understand the interests and how they are different there, which I think is very important, because the way that I might represent the need for action is different than others might do, and what's persuasive to their policymakers and what's persuasive to their public is different than what's persuasive to mine. And so we also need to sit with each other and really understand where the levers are, how we can amplify the more impactful messages, how we can sort of align them so that even though we may be giving slightly nuanced ones, they're pushing towards the same direction. So it's an opportunity that we have, and I think it's a question of developing it concertedly.
Great answer.
Yeah, I think one last thing that I would add is that we need two things, I believe, among many others, of course. One is to have political will at the highest level, no? Because if there's no political will from governments, nothing will happen. And from those in different sectors of society, you need the will from them in really to push and go forward in this direction. No?
Oh, fantastic. And I think that brings me to my next question, Gustavo. What do you think needs to be done by civil society in order to keep the issue of methane, aggressive methane mitigation at the heads of the state level, and also perhaps in a manner that has been the most successful, which is the Montreal Protocol? How do we combine these two worlds, making sure that it's still at the heads of the state level and forms has the same structure to the Montreal Protocol, because that's a tested and successful model to follow?
Yes, as I already mentioned, civil society has to continue doing the pressure through the media and through legal actions, etc. But one thing that I did not say, and which I think will be very useful, is that civil society can bring the data. No? Civil society can bring science, can bring technical information, can bring legal arguments. No? Because that's the best way to put something forward. No? You need to have a base. No? You need to have a structure on where you have something to say, where you have a standing. Because if not, they will say, these guys are just fooling around. No? So in order for civil society to be very serious, bring the facts, bring the issues, bring the information. No? And with that, you can give it to the decision-making public officers, and then can go in the right direction. No?
Absolutely, absolutely. Tim?
Yeah, I would just like to add, I worked on the Kigali Amendment, the effort to try to get HFCs under the Montreal Protocol for 7 years, and the implementation ever since we adopted it. And one of the things I like to reflect on is the approach that we took there gave us confidence that we would get the HFC emission reductions that we needed. I like to create a counterfactual, hypothetical. Had we come to the UNFCCC and adopted a pledge that had imperfect coverage, but committed us to some sort of reductions, and left it at there, we would not have the confidence that we're going to get those reductions that we now have with HFCs. And so this is a start. This is a start towards building out something more fit for purpose around the methane issue. And it's going to take some institution building, some framework to deliver. We had the benefit with HFCs of simply inheriting the Montreal Protocol and its institutional framework. I think we're in a position here where we're going to have to think a little bit more creatively about how we would build something around methane. If there are things that we can call upon, or there are existing institutions and efforts that we can incorporate into this framework, fantastic. But there'll be areas where we also need to think creativity about what we want to build around it and what we want to construct. And so we're at the beginning, but we need to move quickly. And I will just note that the Montreal Protocol itself was negotiated within about 2 years. So reflecting back on that, it was once we got the mandate to start to do something, it went rather quickly. And we ended up getting the most successful multilateral environmental agreement in the land. And ideally, we can do something similar here with methane.
That's absolutely true. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure and honor to be sharing the stage with you and being able to discuss these very important points. If I could just summarize very quickly what's been the gist of this discussion so that our viewers can take this away as the learnings and the sharing of experiences. I'll start with what you said. What's more important than life? So I think that is going to be the new mantra. It is going to be the new mantra, the new motto. And the takeaways from what I understand is harmonizing and synergizing the coalition efforts globally, making sure that we have robust monitoring, reporting, verification measures, and making sure that we have more and more data from the satellite, the carbon map, as one of the speakers mentioned, coming in and filling in the gaps in the data that then finalize baselines, are able to do scenario analysis, and more importantly, what Gustavo has been mentioning over and over again, I think there's a little more to dig deep into what we can do legally, through legislatives, through regulations, to make the global methane a more realistic agreement, which could then have action plans. So if I've concluded that and correctly, then maybe we can start on with our other discussions. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you,
It's a
Zerin.
pleasure. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Thank you.
joining us. Thank you.